My favorite Zoom virtual background is a fake library that's like 100 stories high because everybody's got the books behind them because that's what you're
Right.
supposed to do. But we both got reality. Look, I appreciate your making the time. Just first and foremost, how you doing? How's the family? How's the people? How are folks home in Kansas? It doesn't look like that's a hot spot yet. But
Yeah.
how are pies everywhere?
No, thanks for asking. Certainly, we've been holding up relatively well given the circumstances. My sister in Philadelphia, my parents back home, and I seem to be doing pretty well. The kids are, getting used to the rhythm of the days now that we've hit the summer months. And knock on wood, at least we've been healthy, and that's all that we could ask for. I certainly hope the same is true for you too, with you, the missus, and the kids. We want
Yeah, I
you to.
appreciate it. Look, as we discussed right before this, my kids are old. I now send my kids to get the groceries. Like I am the only at-risk player in the on the field right here. How are you doing maintaining your work-home boundaries? Because my guys are so old. It's been pretty easy where I've got my home office, which is awesome. The house is pretty well apportioned. The only issue, frankly, Amy, who's been more of a floater, but hey, Viasat's satellite company, they're supposed to be able to operate from anywhere anyway. How about you guys? How are you doing with the work home boundary? I find I don't know when work stops. I don't know when life starts.
Actually a very good way to put it. It's been a challenge over the last 3.5 months. I've been here in the home office. This little corner of my library has gotten a lot of use, and but also juggling, of course, the demands of the job with my primary job, which is of course being a dad to two great young kids. And so that's been hard. But luckily, the combination of connectivity and persistence has gotten us through. And I can't say enough about our fantastic FCC staff. They too have faced some of the same challenges I have, and they've been putting incredible work product across the finish line, not just on the bread and butter work that we do, but on some of the pandemic related work that we've done. And so hats off to them for dealing with this daily disruption in a way that I think is just incredible and speaks to the best of public service.
I'm glad to hear that. I'm going to ask you about that in 1 second. Although the weird question: do you ever wear shoes? Like I find I'm not wearing. I never wear shoes anymore. It's a little weird that we're having a business conversation and I'm wearing Game of Thrones socks.
So I can confess, I've done a couple of events in Crocs because frequently what will happen is running outside with the kids and then have to bolt back in, throw on the jacket, and just have the Crocs on. So yeah, I haven't. I don't know if I've gone completely shoeless and sockless at any point, but yeah, maybe every now and then it might have happened.
All right, so you were mentioning the commission, and we're definitely interested in the work broadly, but uh, separate from the substance of what you were doing, one would hope of any agency in the federal government should be able to go remote quick. One would have thought and hoped the FCC did, and I'm interested both in how you found the transition from a life where you were in the office doing the meetings, it was all face to face, like so many of us, you went remote. And I know with my organization, there are new challenges and also new opportunities, but it feels like some things maybe stick and may change forever. I know right before this, you were on an international conversation. I'm curious, how are you finding the new normal? What you think will stick, and maybe what you miss the most from your great office with a great view.
Well, certainly what I miss the most is just the daily interaction with people. Of course, the people who come in and meet with us and teach me a lot of things about technology, but also the folks in the FCC staff who I just get to see every day in my office or walking around the hallways or down in the elevator bays, just chatting with them. I really miss that personal interaction. But what I will say is that we've been incredibly productive, and that's a credit in part to our IT staff. We shifted to mandatory telework pretty early on in March, and that required, of course, the IT infrastructure to be there for our workforce to be as effective as they have been. And so hats off to them for working on that and making sure that everybody, for the most part, has had a seamless experience. It's different, of course, psychologically, but nonetheless, from a functional standpoint, it's been there when we needed it.
And how much of this do you think? Like one of the things um, I was pretty allergic to video chatting before the pandemic. It just always seemed like a pain in the butt, and particularly because I would go off my laptop, so I looked like the sitcom version of the weird blind date showing up at the door, and you'd see in the peephole. And I found now, while it's nice to be with people. Boy, is that an efficient way sometimes to have a meeting, or make a present, instead of flying across the country to make a presentation and killing 3 days, I can just take a shower. How
Right.
much do you feel like the work of the agency may be forever expanded or transformed as a result of things you're learning about how you do business?
That's a great question. I mean, certainly, I think a lot of the work that we tended to do in the office can be done outside, and we've done it over the last 3.5 months. And so that's proof of concept. And then the question is, well, how much of that remains? And we have yet to determine how that's going to transpire as we think about when and how to move back to our old digs and how to get restarted, I guess, in the physical space of our headquarters. But in the meantime, I will say that a lot of the online meetings I've had have been quite efficient. There's something about being on a video chat or even a phone call that really focuses the mind of all the participants. And so typically what we do in my office, at least, is have a 30-minute block for a meeting. And what I found is a lot of people who need to talk to us, they'll reserve that 30-minute block, but I mean, the conversation, the meat of it will happen in 10 minutes. And they'll say, okay, look, we know you're busy, we're busy too, and we've got all these other things to handle. Let's just call it a day. And so we were actually much more focused and efficient on both ends. And so hopefully that's one of the things that we can do going forward, is to streamline the process for everybody. We don't want stakeholders to have to spend a lot of time and money flying all the way to Washington and taking an hour or whatever it is to talk to us if the job can be done in a shorter period of time. So hopefully that's a win for everybody.
Yeah, it's I've observed the same, and I was at first all happy about less wasted time, but I also noticed less wasted time also is less downtime. And I
Yeah.
don't know about you, a lot of the time, I mean, you don't walk around the eighth floor, you stay in position, and we come to see you. But a lot of the time, I find walking between meetings on the hill or on the eighth floor or just downtown, it's that unstructured thinking time that you still get when you take a shower or when you walk the dog, where so many ideas happen. I found, like you were saying, Zooms and virtual meetings are super efficient, but you kind of lose a little bit of the unstructured, sometimes brainstormy stuff. I
Right.
haven't I haven't solved for that yet.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I haven't either. And that's one of the things hopefully we'll try to iron out. But the other thing I will flag is that it's made it a lot easier for me to accept meeting offers or speaking invitations that are outside of DC. And just this morning, you mentioned the international call. I mean, it's in the old days to go through to do an event like that through the World Economic Forum. I mean, we'd have to figure out, okay, travel and dates and who can come and who, all that kind of logistics. Whereas here it's just, hey, boom, we have an hour-long call with the Minister of Telecommunications in India, with a representative from Norway, with somebody from South Africa, another from UK. You're all free at this time? Okay, look, great, let's just do it. Here's the link. And so that makes it much more efficient for everybody to be able to participate. And that part of it, I think, has been really useful for me to keep in touch with, especially my counterparts from other countries. And I've done similar calls with my counterparts in Brazil and in Europe and other places. So that, from that point of view, it's been a little bit of a plus.
That's great. That probably will stick. So I'm going to turn a little more. We advertised and intend this to be the broadband past, present, and future, but I would note that, and some have covered this, so it's not like it's an original thought. But one of the great success stories of the pandemic has been the resilience of networks. We
Yeah.
saw, and you probably know numbers better than I, but we've seen 20-30% spike in traffic. My home, maybe less so your home, but I would had college kids doing college, and everybody was consuming a lot of bandwidth, and yet the internet, as it was intended to, stayed really strong. I haven't seen a lot of stories where the network where it is failed. The stories are about where the network isn't and who doesn't have access, which I want to talk about in a minute. But I don't know if you have thoughts on why things worked as well as they did, given where they were.
It's a good question. Certainly, I think the networks have performed extremely well in the United States. In fact, just recently, a report came out suggesting that mobile broadband speeds in the US had actually gone up over the pandemic, contra China, which had gone down 40%, and about two-thirds of the countries in the European Union, which had gone down 30%. And that, I think, is a testament to the fact that, as you pointed out, the network architecture for our wired and wireless networks has been incredibly strong. They tended to construct these networks for an anticipated peak that would go up over time. And when that peak actually, when the peak usage did go up over the last 3 months, some 20 to 35% we've heard on the fixed side, perhaps even more than that in terms of voice mobile calls and the like. Those networks have been able to withstand the load. And to me, at least, it's a credit in part, of course, to the private sector that was forward thinking and made these decisions in terms of infrastructure investment and the proper way to construct a network. But it's also because of the regulatory certainty and incentives that the FCC has given over the last 3 years. By clearing out some of the underbrush, by maximizing the business case for deployment, we've enabled them to make these critical investments, in many cases years before the pandemic was ever heard of, that allowed us to now have a broadband ecosystem that has allowed hundreds of millions of Americans to telework and do remote learning and telehealth and all the rest of the things we love broadband for. So to me, this is, knock on wood at least so far, a tremendous success story that I think requires more attention.
There's also some selfless broadband spectrum sharers. I recall you guys announced some players out there who said, for now, we've got some spectrum, and instead of building on it today, we're going to let other people deploy right now because it's needed.
Absolutely, and I salute those carriers that have been working cooperatively with each other. I mean, it's in a sense, the industry counterpart to the saying, we're all in it together. And so they're looking to take those unused or underused spectrum assets and hand it to somebody who can use it in a pinch. And that's made a big difference. There's been independent reporting that some of the STAs we've granted special temporary authorities to use some of that spectrum in the 600 megahertz band, 2.5 gigahertz, and even 5.9 gigahertz has increased speeds for some of these wireless companies up to 50% or more. And so that's been a big help. And so going forward, at least, I think this is a useful lesson that we can draw, that when you put airwaves in the hands of those who are going to use it to benefit consumers, really the sky's the limit. It's just the physics that's going to be the limiting step.
I'll search your comparative to whether it's China or EU. Also, it also, from what you described, feels like maybe the as ugly sometimes as our you got your wireline, you got your wireless, you got your satellite and others, but that also creates a level of redundancy and capacity that, you know, a nation that had invested in a single national champion deployment may not have necessarily had the same.
I can agree more. And I think that our market-based approach to encourage all kinds of companies using all kinds of technologies to compete ultimately is better calibrated to suit the public interest than the command and control model, where you pick a national champion, you subsidize it, you block out competition. Ultimately, over time, I think you frustrate innovation, you limit the applications and services consumers can benefit from. And yes, you might have an advantage in the short term, but over time, that advantage starts to erode. And so that's why I think the American model of encouraging everyone to invest and compete is a superior one.
All right, so we've hit, I would say, half of broadband past. The American model clearly is showing a lot of its strengths and the network showing its resiliency. At the same time, a huge part of the story are the gaps. You know,
Yeah.
the people who either can't afford it or aren't covered by a network in the first place, or whose coverage is not ready for Zoom time, as it were. And I had emailed you in part in advance, just saying, by the way, one question I wanted to ask is almost time machine. Like, where did we not get it right? Because just there are too many millions of Americans who don't have access when they need it. I'm not one who believes we should have just made it a national, national service. I don't think we'd all have had DSL, or we'd have all had an ISDN or something, and we'd be all happy. That can't be right. At the same time, the people who most need access don't have access. What coulda, shoulda, woulda we done, and when might we have done it in the years leading up to today that would have helped plug these gaps?
It's a fantastic question. And to me, it underscores the remarks I gave to the FCC staff on my first full day in office, January 24th of 2017. And I told them then, we have many important things on our plate. Nothing is more important than closing the digital divide, making sure that every American has access to what I call digital opportunity. In my first major speech as chairman at Carnegie Mellon back in March of 2017, the talk at the time was about an infrastructure plan. I said then, if Congress does this, I really hope they include some funding for broadband to do for rural America what was done for rural America back in the 1930s in terms of electrification. And so I do hope that the current pandemic has focused people's attention on the importance of connectivity. In terms of policies that could have been different, or where we lost our way, I do think we wasted a lot of time. And for example, the 2011 National Broadband Plan proposed doing a reverse auction, but the first reverse auction wasn't held until we conducted the Connect America Fund Phase 2 auction in 2018. The same thing with the years-long focus on public utility regulation to solve problems that simply didn't exist in the internet ecosystem. We're looking to re-regulate special access and essentially disincentivizing high-capacity infrastructure delivered to businesses, forcing companies to focus their investments on propping up the fading copper networks of the past instead of focusing those investments on fiber. I mean, those are the kinds of things that on their own, but especially together, create an environment in which companies, which of course are going to behave rationally, will limit their investments because the regulatory burden is such that the return on the investment isn't going to be there. So I wish we could embrace that more market-based approach to closing the digital divide and really focus on the divide itself as opposed to some of these other regulatory rabbit holes that really didn't serve the consumer at the end of the day.
Well, I don't know that Blair Levin is attending, but if he is, Blair was right, and he tried to avoid rehashing and relitigating political quagmires, and was the leader on the reverse auction. So, and if he's listening, it's another pat on the back for Blair Levin. But he is a good friend of mine and probably yours as well. So I agree with you that the businesses are rational actors. And I'm sorry, quick aside for those who are attending, if you'd like to ask a question, although I know there is a way to ask a question. My suggestion is go ahead and submit it digitally. This isn't like a Zoom where you get to, we see your face, but I will be able to look through and ask some of the questions for you. So feel free to submit them when you want to. Ajit, you were saying, or Mr. Chairman, you were saying,
we're friends here.
Yeah, but it's while the tape's rolling, I should be properly formal. You're right. Businesses are rational actors, and to the extent you make them invest in both, keep the copper network and invest in another network, you run out of investment. At the same time, one of the challenges will always be that, whether it's 3G, 4G, 5G, or 100G, the best return on investment are usually the wealthiest customers in the most dense areas and the business services versus, individuals who are on the edge. What are your thoughts on the right policies going forward, to help the people who are the worst ROI customers, but as somebody who believes in American opportunity, are arguably the most important customers to connect? They're going to be the least profitable customers to connect. So that's a market failure. And rational economic actors don't solve that problem. And I don't believe you can just simply say we want CSR or goodwill of carriers. I mean, carriers have shown remarkable goodwill so far and with your leadership to not cut folks off, which is great. But going forward, we've got to make the investments to cover these folks and to give them the same kind of broadband that the Mehlman family has. We've got to make that something that economically rational actors will do. How do we do that?
That's absolutely right, Bruce. And to me, at least, it begins with a recognition that there are parts of this country, there are communities in this country that are never going to be economical to serve. The population is too sparse, or the average income is too low, and no company is going to be able to build a case to go to a bank and say, hey, can you loan me several $1 million to lay a few fiber lines to a part of the country that has one person per square mile or even less than that. And I've seen that for myself. I mean, some of my last visits before the pandemic ceased our travel were to the Wind River Reservation in rural Wyoming and to a part of Southeast Ohio, which is a very struggling part of Appalachia. And in each of those places, you see just the terrain is challenging, the communities are struggling, and no business is going to say, yep, sign me up, I've got millions to spare. This is exactly where I'm going to spend this investment. And that's where I think the FCC comes in. I've been very aggressive in reforming our USF programs to give companies that were willing and able to serve those areas some help, both in terms of universal service funding and in terms of streamlining our regulations to give them the maximum business incentive to deploy those networks. And we're starting to see some of the changes. Just a couple of months ago, actually last fall, I guess it was, I got to meet some folks on the outskirts of a small town in North Dakota where Cullen Quill was telling me that he was getting hooked up with gigabit fiber that very day, thanks in part to an FCC Universal Service Fund program. And when I asked him what a difference it would make in his life, he kind of paused for a second. He never had an occasion to think about such a problem, but they said, yeah, you know what, now my wife and kids don't have to bundle up into the truck and go to Bismarck to find a neighborhood McDonald's there where they can upload or download stuff over the Wi-Fi network. And that's the kind of thing that you and I don't have to think about, but millions of Americans do. And so I know that, here in Washington, there's always a political fight over this or that, or let's score some political points against or for the FCC. But to me, the rubber meets the road out in places like Mandan, North Dakota, and Wind River Reservation, and Cape and Springs, West Virginia, places that aren't going to be on the front pages of the newspaper that are vital nonetheless to being able to say there is equal opportunity in this country.
So availability feels like we're looking at the gap. Availability is, I don't know if it's half, but the two pieces to talk about are availability and affordability.
Right.
So, a question just for the family, Quill, I think you said the name was, the family
Yeah.
that was going to McDonald's. It's great if they get it available. At the same time, I feel like the hit here is, and it's worth it. I like my FiOS service, but it's a couple $100. What do we do about the fact that the fiber or not the fiber, the connectivity, whether it's satellite, whether it's wireless, 5G or FiOS, what do we do about the fact that ain't cheap?
That's exactly one of the concerns that we've heard from consumers, and I think there are now several different tools in the toolbox. One is to continue to encourage competition. For example, through some of the 5.9 gigahertz spectrum and 6 gigahertz spectrum we freed up, we're now allowing fixed wireless providers to enter the marketplace to compete against some of the fixed line competitors. And that competition is one way of ensuring that costs just naturally through market forces go down. But even beyond that, we've been relaxing our rules over the last several months in the Lifeline program, which targets low-income consumers, making sure that we get rid of or waive some of the decertification and re-enrollment rules, allow rural tribal customers to sign up for 45 days without documentation, making sure that people who've newly lost their jobs don't have to submit 3 months of workplace documentation. I mean, those are the kinds of things we've been doing to boost enrollment in the Lifeline program. And there are a lot of different tools in the toolbox that we can use, and hopefully Congress will add to that, both through greater authorization to the FCC for more authority to do things like telehealth and remote learning, but also through funding, which is critical. And I know that there are, of course, different fiscal demands on the Congress at any given time, but to me, at least, if you talk to consumers who are out there, broadband's pretty much at the top of the list for many of them. And so I would hope they would give the FCC more resources to be able to do that kind of job, as they did in the COVID-19 telehealth program.
So drill down on that just if we can for a minute, because our pal Margaret McGill from Axios had asked specifically about, I think it may have been yesterday, where Commissioner Starks was saying Lifeline's been undersubscribed. And I don't know whether that's just encouraging consumers to be aware of it, or whether there are barriers to its more efficient use, or whether it runs out of dollars, although logically it doesn't if the point is insufficiently subscribed. And in that regard, I've always wondered, it feels like an old Senator Sununu when O'Reilly was up on the Hill way back when. I feel like they were talking about treating Lifeline almost like food stamps, where those families that need it ought to have it and ought to have the ability to use it where and how they choose. What are your thoughts on how do you make Lifeline better known, better subscribed, and more helpful to families?
Great point. So one of the things we've been doing is working aggressively with other agencies to make sure that they spread the word. So for example, the FCC staff on its own over the last 3 months, I've directed them to get in touch with HHS and VA and other agencies that have a consumer-facing function like that, agencies that administer SNAP-like programs, for example, to make sure that they distribute word about some of these Lifeline reforms and availability to the people they serve. We've done the same thing with state agencies. We've also reached out in particular to hundreds, if not thousands, of organizations that serve consumers, for example, food banks and other relief organizations, to help them get the word out. In addition to that, one of the things we've been doing, and it's not sexy, and I understand it's not the most appealing thing to talk about, but just the back-end IT work that is necessary to make the process easier. On my watch, we made it a priority to stand up the national verifier, which now has connections across the country. That's one way of automating the system of getting into the Lifeline program so that you can have an instant check about whether you're eligible or not. And that simple function is something that had sometimes stood in the way of consumers signing up. So we're always looking forward to doing more Lifeline type reforms that can be helpful to consumers. And if there are other good ideas out there, let us know. We're always all ears to hear them.
Great. Let me turn to a school. And your guys are you first and third grade?
Yeah, rising first and third grade. So they're both very excited. It's a big transition.
All right, so that's a little different. I got two in college and one going to be a senior in high school. And one of the things that I found, and I actually published this, the last thing I put out in looking at COVID with my abuse of PowerPoint infographics. But I went and I noticed in the state of New York, legislators in Albany had gone in and had specified that K-12 schools had to have 12 fire drills per year, not 11, not 13. 8 of them they specified were shelter in place. 4 of those, no, 8 of them were evacuation, and 4 had to use the fire escapes, and 4 were shelter in place. Yet there was nothing in the law and nothing in practice about ever practicing remote learning. And it's, even on snow days, where if you think about, and again, first and third's a little bit young, but why, if there is snow, does everybody say, guess we can't do anything today? Obviously you want your kids, I want my kids to know how to evacuate a burning building, but to not ever practice remote learning. And what I found with a lot of the teachers, just talking to my college guys, these are phenomenal classroom teachers who sometimes are total basket cases digitally and just don't know what they're doing. And they're the one like would play some music and just leave. First, I don't know if your guys are probably too young for firsthand experience, but I'm interested in what you're hearing from educators. And then second, it feels like, and this is John Edgerton's thought, but it feels like Congress has leaned pretty far forward, saying you can interpret classroom to get to remote learning, which in theory could make E-rate funds available. And I'm just curious what the commission is thinking, and as we approach what sure feels like, every pandemic always has second waves. It sure feels like we're going to have challenges in the fall at times and in places. And I'm interested in your thoughts on how to maximize the value we can get out of remote learning, which is a lot better than not learning.
Certainly a lot to chew on there. What I would say is, no, not at all. So what I would say first and foremost is to John's question, I would reiterate what I told the Senate yesterday, which is, look, I understand the frustration here, and no one supports remote learning more than I do. And that's part of the reason why 3 months ago, I sent a letter to Congress saying, we need you to give us authorization and funding to set up a remote learning initiative, something similar to what we're asking you to do on the telehealth side. Congress gave us authority to do and funding to do the COVID-19 telehealth program, and there, the results speak for themselves. I mean, you're seeing healthcare facilities across the country doing groundbreaking things on healthcare, from mental health to child transplantation. But on the education side, we didn't get authority. And so we're working within the constraints of the current law, for example, by relaxing the gift rules and the like, to enable schools to get the connectivity they need. But the problem is that term, it's classrooms in the statute. I understand that some people think we can just waive a statutory term. As a lawyer, I know we can't do that. And it's easy to pontificate about it or demagogue it. But at the end of the day, the statute is the statute. And that's why we've gone proactively to Congress to get the authority we need to do some more remote learning type initiatives. And if they did that, then I think we might be able to take that authority and run with it quickly, as we have with telehealth. In the meantime, what I will say is that in the CARES Act, Congress allocated $16 billion that's going to local school districts around the country. And so we believe that those, per the statute, one of the purposes for which that $16 billion can be used is education technology. And so we're working now through the Department of Education to bring this to the attention of school districts to say, look, there's a huge amount of money here that's available for education technology. Work with us to get your school kids the connectivity they need, so that when the fall comes around, especially if we have a spike, as you pointed out, we'll be able to do remote learning in a more holistic way than we might have on the fly back in March, April, and May.
All right, so I get what you need from Congress and what you want to see from Congress. Is there anything from the private sector vis-a-vis remote learning and education that you either you hope to see more of, or that you think has been lacking but would be a difference maker?
I mean, I think certainly the partnership between communications companies and the education community has been a strong one. I would simply say that the FCC stands ready and willing to help in that conversation. That's part of the reason why over the last couple of months, even in the midst of the pandemic, one of the important things that was important to me to get done was the 6 gigahertz initiative, pushing at 1200 megahertz for Wi-Fi out there so that school kids anywhere could be able to learn. If you need to download high bandwidth videos from school, you can be able to do that over 6 gigahertz spectrum, and vice versa. If you need to upload something, you can do that too. So we're trying to put in place the building blocks for educators and technologists to use to improve the remote learning experience. I know we have more work to do, but just know that you have a partner here at the FCC.
Great, and I'll remind folks, we're going to lose the chairman at 2:55, so that Montana doesn't yell at me for you're missing a 3. Although I don't know that she's a yeller at all, but I made a promise, and I'm good for my word. but we welcome questions. Here's one, and it's not letting me figure out who's asking it. You said yesterday at the Senate hearing that if more money is needed for RDOF 2, after you know how, is good, many unserved locations are in partially served areas, a future FCC could increase the funding. Where would that additional money come from with USF contribution already over 26% in the coming quarter?
Yeah, so the point I was making there was to the extent that the phase one money, the phase one budget is less than, or sorry, the amount we need to spend on phase one to cover certain locations is less than the 16 billion. Any leftover funds would roll over into phase two. And if for whatever reason phase two is found to be inadequate, that remainder, whatever it is, then a future FCC could always look at increasing resources there. And there, I mean, of course, Congress is talking about different vehicles to give the FCC additional authority. There's a conversation about some of the initiatives that Senator Wicker and others have put on or have introduced or have talked about to be able to give the FCC more resources to promote rural broadband. Or the other conversation, of course, is through the Universal Service Fund itself. And that's what I had in mind. I don't have, I'm not thinking about how any contribution reforms might have to be made or where the, that particular amount of funding would come from. Just to say that it's not as if that $4 billion is set in stone for phase two. It can never be amended whatsoever. That's simply the point I was going to make. There's more flexibility there.
Got it. Thank you. I'll ask you, I'd say I'm a little bit of a tech nerd, but A, so are you, and B, anybody watching this clearly is or is being, punished by their parents. On 5G, there's a fascinating amount of, some of it's technology, a lot of it's economics, and some of it's geopolitics. And we're, in some ways, I'm really excited about the Open RAN prospect because America's great at software. We actually been pretty good on hardware too, but there's some combination of, other nations, China in particular, subsidizing development, which made them below cost and economical, and there isn't, Qualcomm is extraordinarily brilliant, but they don't have the range necessarily that say a Huawei does. And so it feels like in some ways we were missing elements of the necessary hardware for 5G. But then when you learn about Open RAN, there's opportunities to leverage what we're best at, software, to cut costs. And I was just curious, as you look at 5G, and there's a ton to look at because you've got to worry about the spectrum allocation, you've got to worry about, cyber and reliability. But I'm curious how you see the next 1 to 3 years on 5G, and particularly how America can leapfrog and become a leader, if not the leader in this.
A great question. So I tend to be very bullish on the next several years in terms of the development of open or virtual RAN solutions. And that's not to say, of course, that O-RAN will completely displace the full stack hardware approach that we have today, but simply to say that it's going to be a much more textured, much more nuanced 5G network architecture going forward. And I've had the chance over the last several months to visit with a number of the very interesting companies that are doing work in this space. And when I was in Japan in December, I met with Rakuten and heard about some of their groundbreaking efforts in this space, but also some of great American companies too, Mavneer and Parallel Wireless and Altiostar. I mean, these might not be household names, but they're really doing some important work here in the US to innovate in this space. And our hope is, of course, that not only will the software-based approach be more cost-effective, of course, for wireless carriers to deploy, especially at scale, and not only will it be more manageable since you have a more centralized management system that could operate the networks as opposed to having hardware at every single site, but also from a security perspective, the operators would have more insight into some of the security vulnerabilities or strengths of their networks. And what I mean by that is typically with a full stack hardware vendor, the wireless carrier has to give them the keys and say, okay, well, just build the thing, manage it for us, manage the security aspects in particular for us, and let us know if anything is coming up. I mean, that grossly oversimplifying, of course, but with a software-based solution, they can retain control over the management of the network. They can choose where these different software based applications are, how deep into the network, are they on the edge of the network, et cetera. They can piece together what components or what software modules they want as they see fit and then manage it all together. So I think giving the operators much more control will ultimately be better from a security perspective for them and for the country. So that's one of the downsides of the pandemic. We had a great forum set up on March 26th for virtual RAN. We had a great lineup of panelists, and I really do hope that once the situation recedes a bit rather, we will be able to restart that. It's an important conversation and well beyond the FCC's headquarters too.
Hey man, use Zoom. You can do that thing next week.
I know, that's true. Yeah, I mean, we should look into that then. So give this background, all these old maps, a little more work.
Well, the idea that a virtual RAN conference hasn't gone virtual, yeah, I'm gonna let people smarter than me figure it out.
Pretty
Uh,
meta.
a media question came in. I'm going to ask it just because it's almost fun, but I know how this goes. You know how this goes. Will you consider remaining FCC chairman in the next administration if the president wins a second term? And I guess there's a presumption in that Joe Biden would not ask you to stick around, which we don't need to get into.
I mean, I personally would be shocked if a President Biden didn't ask me to stick around, as I'm sure the question too. But no, look, I'm not thinking about any of that stuff. I'm really, as you've seen just yesterday at the Senate hearing, I mean, the number of topics that came up from 5G to Wi-Fi to rural broadband, and we've been racing ahead on so many different fronts that I haven't had time to stop and think about what comes next. And so I really just focused on the job, and whatever decision I have to make at a future time, I'll make it a future time. And in the meantime, just keep doing this job that I love.
So you don't rule out running for president?
Oh man, I think if that ever came to pass, then I think we'd have some serious problems, my friend. So other than dad jokes and the occasional good tweet, I'm not sure what I bring to the table other than maybe gab.
These days, dad jokes and the occasional good tweet, that sounds pretty appealing. All right, Alton Drew has asked, the U.S. Virgin Islands is still recovering from the 2017 hurricanes. Has the COVID pandemic raised any additional network concerns in the territory? Any updates?
Great question, Alton, and thanks for that. So it has, of course, and not just because of the pandemic, but also because, as he knows, and as folks in the Virgin Islands likely know, we are already into hurricane season. And so we're already thinking about what steps we can take to harden and make those networks more resilient. As he knows, we set up the Connect US VI Fund, and we recently made an announcement on that front about, of course, front loading a lot of that funding to make sure that Virgin Island broadband networks are stronger. And recently, I think it was last week, again, I've lost all track of time during the pandemic, but I'm pretty sure it was last week or maybe earlier this week, we made a critical announcement that some of the first broadband support from the FCC for 5G is going to the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. And so I'll tweet that out. I know he follows me on Twitter. I will tweet that out so you can get a link to it. But this is really groundbreaking. The first ever FCC subsidies for 5G are going to the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, particularly because we recognize that they might not get otherwise as strong a investment in infrastructure as the mainland, but also with these hurricanes and the like coming through, we want to make sure that every technology, wireless and wired, is as strong as it can be.
Great, thanks. Monica Flippin asks, do you support USF contribution reform? And if so, what would the process look like?
Oh man, how much time do we have? I mean, this is an evergreen topic that comes up all the time. And look here, I would defer to Commissioner O'Reilly, who's the chairman of the Joint Board. I certainly wouldn't want to get in front of him on whatever he might be thinking. There's some difficult questions here, no doubt about it. And he was clear yesterday, as I think many people have been, that at a time when people are struggling with their finances, the last thing that someone wants to do is to impose a broadband tax on top of that they would have to pay. So there's a balance there that has to be struck, and how to strike it is something that I think federal and state regulators are going to be struggling with in the time to come.
No one has asked, so I will ask, if they can't play the NFL season, does that mean the Chiefs remain national champions, or is it? Yes.
So no, this is a great question. So I recently had a chance to talk to Chris Jones, who was one of the defensive stars of the Chiefs, and so I told him in my book, man, you guys just won Super Bowl 54. If there's not a Super Bowl this coming January, February, whatever it is, and we go 2 years from now, by definition, you're still the defending champ. So yes, it would be terrible, I think, if I didn't have football this coming Sunday and fantasy football games to win against my relatives and friends. But on the other hand, to be able to say the Chiefs are the defending champion for a number of years, that would be pretty cool. So as you can tell, now that we've got another ring on our finger, I'm on cloud nine still, but 4 months later.
And I don't even remember. I mean, I assume you're a Royals fan as opposed to a Nats, although they don't necessarily go head to head as much. I'm feeling the same way about the Washington Nationals. Like
Yeah.
I really do miss live sports though. You can only watch so many Jeopardy reruns before you want to just dunk your head in a toilet.
But yeah, that's funny. That's one of the things I was trying to figure out as I was getting so into Last Dance and shows like that. Am I into it because it's somewhat nostalgic and I really love that era of the Bulls? Or is it also that because there's no live sports at all, any sports programming is going to be that much more appealing? And I haven't figured out how that works out, but I will say I really miss it too. There's something about it that really brings people together. And it's hard. It just is part of our sense of community, I guess, is rooting for or rooting against a particular team.
And it to the point we were talking about before, it's I almost feel like I need sports so that I know what month it is and what day of the week it is, and there's a sameness without some things like that, changing things. Let's see if I have another one. I've got a question. There's somebody asked how the FCC can help grow a native US 5G ecosystem, but we asked and you answered that.
Yeah, I mean, look,
So here, I'm
yeah,
sorry, here's one from Rich, and for whoever put that in, go back and roll the tape back. I feel like the chairman directly responded to that with a good answer. From Rich Tarani, CEO of TMC, does the FCC need to preempt issues related to conspiracy theories? There have been numerous attacks in Europe, a proactive education program, perhaps. Oh, sorry. I missed the line about it's talking about the vandalism of 5G towers and the absolutely crazy idea that somehow 5G caused COVID. And what do we do about the fever swamps that exist in weird parts of the internet with those kind of absolutely crazy and fairly dangerous because it's led to vandalism conspiracy theories?
yeah. I mean, I remember when I first started hearing about this. I think it came from a story in the Netherlands, and at the time, most people, especially on social media, thought of it as an odd curiosity. But then you started seeing it seep into, I believe, the UK, and then ultimately Canada, and then even here in the United States, we've heard a couple of celebrities suggest that there's some kind of linkage between 5G and the spread of the coronavirus. And I think it's utterly absurd. And I said it as much that there is no connection whatsoever. Virus, analog pathogen that goes through the air, 5G, digital packets that go through the air, very, very different things. And so not only that, I mean, not to be flippant about it, but also I think one of the saddest things is that 5G really could come out of the pandemic as one of the things that's helped people so much. I mean, the ability to use 5G to promote telehealth or remote learning or some of these other things that 5G can enable to enable us to work more efficiently within a closed environment so that we're maintaining social distancing and the like. I mean, these are things that 5G could enable that are put on the shelf if people start destroying infrastructure or just broadly opposing 5G generally because of these unfounded fears. And so I think it's important for people to speak out about the science of it, and I'll certainly use my platform as best I can to do that.
If you had asked, something I published at the start of the year, I was talking about 2020, and my title was "Hunting Black Swans," and I was trying to think of all the, the game-changing sort of things that might have happened. That I had I killed a slide that was talking about wars and pandemics on the theory of I don't want to be a crazy doomsayer. I've always presumed that the thing that should keep me up at night is cyber attack.
Hmm.
And it's we all know it's a risk. We all know there's a variability of response. The NSA and a couple of those and folks like that, and people at the commission do a lot of great works, but the attack surface is increasing exponentially. My kids have learned there's not been even an hour of digital literacy training that I can tell from schools, and certainly it didn't seep into their actual operational behavior. So we kind of all have to hope that the people who make devices are somehow guarding us all. What do you think that can and needs to be done so that we're not all kicking ourselves that just like we should have seen a pandemic risk coming and could have done a lot smarter things the way, say, South Korea did, that we don't find ourselves in a year, we probably wouldn't be able to do this virtually. I don't know, we'd have to do it with like carrier pigeons. But how do we get in front of the so foreseeable cyber risks?
It's a very important question, and a lot of the work I've done over the last couple of years, and in particular the year leading up to the pandemic, was working across government with the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, with the Department of Defense, Department of State, the National Security Council, and others to make this a priority domestically, and also to go abroad to talk to some of our partners and allies and others about the importance of a risk-based framework for understanding cybersecurity. I was part of the delegation, for example, for the US to the Czech Republic, which ultimately came up with some cybersecurity principles, the Prague proposals as they were called, in which a number of nation states agreed on certain risk-based frameworks. And I've had great bilateral conversations with counterparts everywhere from Germany to Malaysia, Vietnam to Brazil about some of these issues. And part of the reason is that the attack surface is greater, of course, in any given country, but also all of these networks are interconnected as well. And so our ability to share information on a government-to-government basis or even on a private basis with entities in other countries could be compromised if those countries choose insecure networks and network equipment. So that's a really important issue. And for our part, at least, I don't think it's any secret that we've been doing everything we can to ensure the security of our networks. We early on proposed to prohibit the use of Universal Service Fund monies on insecure network equipment and services. We are working with Congress on the way forward to implement the Secure and Trusted Network 5G Act. And so I think it's an important conversation that needs to be had. And I think obviously there are great upsides to the fact that we're all connected now, but that also creates vulnerabilities if we're all connected too. So we need to think about both sides of that coin.
And it feels like that's in the world of E-rate as well, making sure that schools that are always hard up for resources, but can use the resources Congress intends for their networking to also make sure they're networking securely. Here's one from John Ingebriston from Telecompetitor. What process will the FCC, my colleague is emailing it because I have a hard time pulling it up. What process will the FCC use to resolve all the challenges that came into the list of census block groups eligible for the RDOF auction? Seems like it has to be done.
Well, so what time is it? 2:50. You should be seeing sometime this afternoon exactly what the answer to your question. We, as the questioner probably knows, we had a limited challenge process in which the list of eligible areas that we put out, I believe it was March 19th, something like that, could be challenged. And so we've been working through some of those challenges and figuring out which ones are valid, which ones are not. And so we're going to be putting out there the list by state of the various eligible locations. And so stay tuned in the next, literally this afternoon, you're going to get the answer to your question, I can promise. So it's going to be some exciting breaking news, and looking forward to what this means for giving some of the would-be bidders in the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund some more certainty to be able to bid and provide high-speed access to folks in those areas.
So I'm going to go slightly outside of your lane here with the last couple of minutes. The nation's really bitterly divided, often in unconstructive ways. And a comment I've made in the past, in fact, when I was up for Senate confirmation and I sat in with Senator Wyden, and I love Senator Wyden. I don't agree with him a lot of the time, but I think the world is a better place and Congress is a way better place with his intelligence and his voice and his passion there. And he looks at my resume and I'm like, I'm a former Republican Party lawyer. I worked on the Hill as a Republican. And he's like, you're a pretty partisan guy. And I was up for Assistant Secretary of Commerce for technology policy. And I said, as I've been working at Cisco, my interest in technology policy, one of the things that appeals to me most about it is that partisanship always seems to stop at the network's edge. And that when you take a look at so many of the great telecommunications policy decisions, they've been bipartisan. And it was a little bit, Larry Irving and I started the Internet Innovation Alliance. Rick Boucher and Kim, the members of it have always been bipartisan. And it's part of what I like and what I value. And I'm a centrist, moderate guy anyway. But what do you think we can do to bring back, even if the broader national culture wars are going to be the way they are, how can we bring back telecommunications and technology policy to where Republicans and Democrats work with each other? It feels like you guys, if the cameras aren't rolling, the commission is a wonderfully bipartisan place. And it's only when, the angertainment of 9 p.m. cable is looking that you guys have to go to your respective corners. But maybe just as a last question, your thoughts on what we can do to, rebuild trust and rebuild some of the bipartisanship that has made the historical telecommunications network and policy so effective.
Yeah, that's something I think about a lot, of course, being in the crucible of Washington politics. And I think ultimately, one of the solutions has to be to get out of Washington. I mean, I've now been to 49 states and the territories of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands here in the US. And when you get out there and you meet people, you have great conversations with them and you realize that their concerns have nothing whatsoever, for the most part, to do with whether they're a Republican or a Democrat. I mean, Cullen Quill, he never told me his politics. I couldn't give a damn about his politics. What excited me was the fact that FCC policies helped him get gigabit fiber. When I was on the Wind River Reservation talking to Northern Arapaho tribal leaders in February, they didn't tell me their politics. I didn't give a damn about their politics. We were just excited that we were focused on getting fiber to their reservation, which had been on the wrong side of the digital divide. And not just on the broadband side, even the radio side too. And when I've had a chance to meet with African American broadcasters in Alabama or Alaskan Native broadcasters above the Arctic Circle, politics never comes up. And there's something about this place that just infects the minds of people in a way, in the sense that they become more tribal and they want to say, if you're not with me, then you're against me, and I'm just going to oppose simply because of who you are, what you happen to believe. And I would say what I believe to my core is what I said in the speech I gave in November of 2017 when I was talking about the value of social media and how social media seems to be driving us apart. And I continue to believe that in many ways. But what I would say is that what you see of America on social media, that's not the America I know. I mean, the people I know are people who look out for their neighbors, who care about putting food on the table for their families, who want to make their community a better and cleaner and healthier place. And politics is an afterthought to them. They don't think of it through that prism. And it sounds weird to say, but I actually think our politics would be so much healthier if people stopped paying attention to politics and focused on what really delivers value at the end of the day. And it's probably a naive hope. Of course, this is a lament that is predated us and will post-date us, I'm sure. But I really do think that the more poisonous the environment gets, the more America's soul loses something of itself. And that would be a sad thing for me because, going all the way back to Tocqueville, one of the things he noted is that we really have a sense of community that's unique among the nations of the world. And that can be lost. It doesn't necessarily have to be there. So hopefully in the time to come, you and I and others who care about this issue can do our parts to help rebuild our civic culture in a way that's healthy.
Well, that's a great point to end on. I would note, and I know you're a big Stratechery Ben Thompson fan, as
Yeah.
am I. Boy, is that guy smart. And I commend to those who are observing here too, when he's talked some about social media. I mean, without a doubt, it's an interesting platform because on the one hand, you correctly point out there's some really destructive voices that are on there, but at the same time, there's a whole lot. What we notice is often negative, but the volume of what's there is at least people I follow, are overwhelmingly positive and constructive. And sometimes even the experts like the CDC are telling you one thing and then go research the Seattle Flu Project because they spotted the trend before the government spotted the trend. And part of the reason Seattle was able to get so far in front of the curve in Seattle was because of the society there that was not the government, but that was leveraging the best of social media. Chairman Pai, I love you on social media. You're a lot of fun. You've got your friends and you've got some interesting followers as well on social media, which is disappointing, but such is democracy and such is freedom of speech. Really appreciate your making the time from home. I hope you didn't put the jacket on just for us. Then again, I hope you don't wear the jacket all day at home. But Montana, I got him done in time, as I told you, for his next thing. Thank you for making the time.
Hey, thanks so much, Bruce. Thanks to the Internet Innovation Alliance for the work that you've done to bring a more thoughtful voice to some of the issues we deal with. And I can't say enough how much I appreciate the friendship and your advocacy.
Thanks to everybody for attending. I'm going to hit stop if I can figure out how. Thanks. You can hang up if you can figure out how.
All right. All right.